and welcome to day 3 of the Systems Thinking Summit. We have a presentation by Benjamin, and he will do it live. So if you have any questions, please post them to the comment section, and we will have some time at the end handing to you the presentation, and you can share your screen, Benjamin. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. Yeah, so I've got a fair amount to cover, and I'll try and trot through. If you put comments in the chat, I may be able to get to them, or I may not. And yeah, I'm trying to cover quite a lot of ground. I'm not sure why, but I always do. I'll introduce myself in a second. I'll try and give my definition of what I call systems cybernetics complexity. Think of it as a set of multiverses, really. And then I'm going to be talking about 3 dimensions in which I'm trying to build learning and insight in that space, and some threats to that from our own egos, and some principles that I try and work on. And I'll flash up during this, and we may get into it later, some systems laws, which a lot of this, which is a good foundation for quite a lot of this. So I'll talk about most of my organizations and connections and things during the course of the presentation, actually. This is very practice-centric, hopefully not just a me-centric thing, but feel free to connect to me if you're not already connected. Everything that's not on there is at bentaylor.com. You'll see on the left there, I've recorded lots of podcast episodes almost 3 years ago, which are still not released, and I had 2 kind of book arrangements, including 1 contract, which I have as yet not completed. So trying to do all these things may have some drawbacks. I'll start off with my definition of systems cybernetics and complexity, which I have an unveiling of. For me, this is at the heart, and I use 2 quotes from philosophy for this. To understand is to know what to do, and I can only answer the question, what am I to do? If I can answer the prior question of which story or stories do I find myself a part. So we exist in a world of complexity made up of the coexistence of nebulosity and pattern. That can be interpreted in lots and lots of, in unlimited ways, and engaged with in unlimited ways, and none of the results are completely predictable. In living in this complexity, distinctions, framings, and ways of seeing emerge that allow us to make sense of things and operate, to make the nebulosity pattern and the multiple interpretability manageable. And that's what generates meaning and value, purpose, legitimacy, power, and ethics, from my perspective. So we shape our world, our way of understanding, interacting, framing, responding, and our world circularly shapes us. This includes the things that we see, but also the things that we don't see, the framings, the undiscussables, the cues for behavior, the unmentionables, the boundaries of what is possible. Despite these framings, the complexity, nebulosity, and pattern and multiple interpretability of the world continue, which means that we can get learning shocks. The classic kind of developmental shock is when your meaning system breaks down, and you have to rebuild it, hopefully more thoroughly and more accurate, more completely, explaining what the old system explained and why the old system broke down. Natural development or results of our ways of seeing can start to seem undesirable. I'm a fairly big fan of capitalism, and yet certain things like the potential destruction of the ecosystemic viability of the human species can start to seem undesirable. So, things that we thought we wanted might turn out to have side effects, etc. And the fact that we're all in our own worlds of meaning and sense making can create conflict, exploitation, and confusion, and do. And of course, people have agency. They can never be fully predicted or controlled. So the good news is we can learn to act differently, to reframe, to change our identity, to enter into that circularity of identity, framing, thinking about things, shaping the world, responding, and then in turn shaping our own identity. That's what I call system cybernetics and complexity, i.e. working with those dynamics. This is a great quote from Maturana. We human beings exist in a cognitive explanatory dynamics that, as such, is like a Moebius circular ribbon with no beginning, no end, and no other side, and which is such that if we want to explain how it operates from some transcendental view, we must destroy it as we invent another side, by cutting it from an arbitrary, imaginary, external perspective as we stand on it. So we're embodied, involved, engaged in this circularity, and we have to make breaks in the circularity in order to frame. But we always should be aware that we are doing that. Or put it another way, as Nietzsche said, every word is a prejudice. Every definition that we use embodies a set of assumptions and framings and understandings and ways of being and practices and community and history. Or in other words, the call is coming from inside the house. So that's the challenge that we've got to work with. So let's put the philosophy aside and get practical. So I think that underlying all of this is a set of systems laws. They're not all properly laws in the true sense of the word. Hence, the book that Patrick Hoverstadt has produced, which I highly recommend, is The Grammar of Systems, which summarizes those really, really well. And there are many and varied systems approaches, and I'll explain our professional competency framework and the apprenticeship. And the final link is to my systems community of inquiry, where I'm trying to just weblog everything that I find about the many, many, many multiverses of systems complexity and cybernetics. To get that level 7 apprenticeship, you need to have sound working knowledge of at least 3 systems approaches, including at least 2 of these more widely used ones. Critical systems heuristics, which is all about understanding how we're setting the boundaries, who are the beneficiaries, who are the victims, what are the implications of our framing of a situation. Soft systems methodology, I hope I don't have to explain to many of you here, but it's about understanding the way we're seeing from these multiple worlds. Systems dynamics I've heard talked about in pretty much all the sessions that I listened to in the conference so far. And the viable systems model for me is the best and most useful, practical, effective underlying way of understanding the underlying dynamics of organization. But there are loads more approaches which we teach and recognize and accredit. But you also need intervention approaches. You also need to understand how to intervene in complex situations. So we have things in there which are not systems practices, which are necessary and supportive to systems practice, from facilitation to strategic planning to project or agile implementation and so on. And you need to know how to combine them, the benefits and limits of each approach, how to determine the appropriate scope, scale, systemic level, how to model, how to design, all of those things. Now, this is difficult, complex. This is a level 7 qualification, a master's level qualification that we're talking about, but it's not unknown, or it's not unknowable, and it's not unknown. It's out there, and it actually works. That doesn't stop there being system cybernetics and complexity arguments in every forum and community and bulletin board and so on that you've ever seen. I think that's because the field is and always will be unbounded. So that's my point. Systems practice isn't mysterious, but it is complex. So for me, I've been supporting and on my own journey, learning about systems cybernetics and complexity in 3 ways. Building systems thinking practice capability, i.e. addressing the field itself, supporting communities of practice and inquiry, and doing systems practice work in my own work, all with significant limitations and constraints. But that's 3 aspects of a mission to develop systems practice in the world. Let me just briefly touch on the threats when we get into this model of thinking that arise from our own egotism. I call this the systems cybernetics and complexity minefield. This is a characterization of behaviors. It can be used for labeling, for discriminating, for evaluating, for supporting our positions. So you have to be very careful with models like this. But when you get into this kind of thinking, you tend to move towards either this is the right way to change the world, we got power to change things over here, or power over, the ability to, using these powerful ideas to seek intellectual property, money, power over others, etc. And to a certain extent, you need that in order to sustain in the world in which we live. You're probably also likely to be more attracted to, this is the right tool, this is the thing, this is the way it works. And that tendency is more inclusive, more open to the herd, the group, more driven by enthusiasm, many more people, perhaps influenced by a few popularizers, and it tends to be more dependent on where they get the ideas from, more flighty, short-term, faddish, in other words. And you might often get people sweeping in a wave of enthusiasm for a new approach, a new movement, a new group, a new idea, and then drifting away, because guess what? Tools are never right, not to fix everything, not in every context. The alternative, of course, and sometimes people flip to this when they learn, oh God, this tool has let me down, is your tools are wrong. So that's exclusive. It's more individualistic. It's more based on grumpiness. It's a few people who are seeking to lead the many, people who are more independent and tend to stick around a lot longer. And there may be some people in this select audience tonight who fit that kind of bill. So the quadrants of this model, the things we're trying to avoid getting sucked into, are the naive enthusiasts who think we're going to change the world with this, or have suddenly learned, soft systems methodology. Why doesn't everybody do this? Everybody could see the world could be different. There'll be no war, etc. The popularizers, who often oversimplify in the interest of getting a following, put the word out there, share the exciting stuff, and focus on the excitement, not on the difficulties. The curmudgeons. Why won't people listen to me? I know what's wrong and what's right out there. If only they'd listen to me, then everything would be better. And the gurus, I spell it that way in recognition that this is appropriation of an important word from a different culture, but we have that word in our culture now, who are interested in staking out their own territory. All four behavior types are saying, my definition is what systems complexity and cybernetics is. The naive enthusiasts want change in the world. They're going to see you, if you approach them, as either an inspiration, part of their gang, or a killjoy, trying to pull their beautiful possibilities from them. The best way to engage with them, in my experience, is to ask them naive questions and draw them into the tougher real world challenges. The popularizers want likes, shares, and followers. They'll see you either as a fan or as a source that they can grab the stuff and share and make merry. And they're subject, they respond well to flattery. You can ask them naive questions as well and draw them into the robust, the 70-year-old methodologies that are still powerful and deep and interesting and engaging. The curmudgeons just want you to realize how damn wrong you are, really. And they're likely to see you as wrong or right if you buy into their approach. Some of my favorite people are curmudgeons, some of my least favorite. It's really important to engage, talk about what works in context, shift the conversation from what's right and wrong to what's actually working in practice in particular contexts. And the gurus want their followers to be locked in, and they want to poison the ground for everybody else. They're going to see you either as a disciple or as a problem. Never flatter gurus, because they're sucking all the power that way. Tease them, draw them into the swampy lowlands of practice, and get practical. That's my advice. And really, you should be applying this to yourself and thinking, which one am I tempted to be in? Which one am I in? How can I? And in the middle is the space of what's actually practical, what's strategic, what's really going to work in this context. So that, for me, is an exploration of traps developed with some members of the CIO board. All responsibility is mine now. Some principles I go into this learning model with are that it is about system cybernetics and complexity as an extended, multivarious, big field. I believe in adult learning, treating people as adults with their own experiences, their own stuff to bring to bear. Peer learning, where we're learning and building from each other, and action learning, doing the work and doing the learning in practice. When we went into evaluation in CIO to set the boundaries of the profession and protect it, in a sense, we chose peer-led, practice-based evaluation. So an experienced peer will look at your portfolio of practice and ask you to account for and interrogate your account of your own systems practice. So it's not passing a test, it's not demonstrating knowledge, it's demonstrating practice, and obviously some self-reflection and some evaluation of yourself as well. What we've set up to define those boundaries of the field are some circularly justified foundations. Those systems laws underlie the systems practices that we acknowledge as part of the field, and it's all subject to challenge and change. So you can propose a new or innovative systems practice by definition, by reference to this uses this and this systems law. And you can also challenge or propose new systems laws by referring to their systemicity. And there is a process for that, very important. So this is not a fixed set of boundaries. And I believe you should go into this with radical self-inquiry. The risk when you get into development of the field in this way is already in putting this master's level apprenticeship in England and Wales into place. We can see the pressure for a kind of race to the bottom, and people will love to go to and provide certificate mills. You can't do it in the apprenticeship system, at least not easily, but there is a pressure in that direction because there's serious evaluation. So we don't want to just, we want to protect the actual practical value and develop the actual practical value and capability. We also don't want that sclerotic fixedness of the institution. These are the boundaries. This is what it is. It's never going to change. We're going to be teaching the same thing in the same way in 70 years, which is very easy to do when you get into professionalism. So why? Well, we're trying to promote the field and promote the practitioners and support them, more power to their elbow, etc. This is a way of attracting and bringing in funding, of generating impact, more work, of generating a wider range and hopefully diversity of practitioners. That doesn't seem to have come through to some of these sessions, unfortunately. But to really build and test and validate the competence of practitioners, but also do the work to set the boundaries of the field, do all of these things before somebody does it wrong and fixes us in the wrong place. And a lot of the discussions I've heard over the last 2 days of this event have been about mistakes in the past and about the way those mistakes get quite fixed. And even if we move beyond them, the world doesn't necessarily know that. In practice, what we're talking about here is crossing the chasm, moving from those few innovators and early adopters across that gap to where the majority are starting to be able to grasp and use this. And for those whose identity is very tied up with being the small innovators, early adopters, the few who've carried the light through the desert low these many years, if that's not a very tortured metaphor, that's really scary because that's threatening to their identity as the few outcasts, the loyal, the true systems thinkers, when every sod could get hold of it and be able to do it. So that's something that we have to confront and accept and understand. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the process that we went through to get to this. And there are really 3 steps. Establishing the set of systems laws through practical application, conversation, and really significant development by Patrick Hoverstadt. Developing a competency framework and a professional qualification to set some boundaries, have a standard, but also to allow systems practitioners to hold their own against other people with professional qualifications and say, yeah, I've got knowledge too. This is a real thing, and get a little bit more respect, hopefully. And then we got to this particular apprenticeship. And of course, there've been many academic courses before, and probably a lot of practice courses, but this is a well-formed, well thought through over many years and developed example that fits in with the others, hopefully in a positive way. So I'm going to zoom past these, but we've got 3 sets of underlying systems laws: structural complexity, dynamic complexity, and knowing and uncertainty. This is an earlier version as used in SIO development days, where we work together to apply them to real problems in practice. And they're much better developed in the book, The Grammar of Systems, which is available worldwide. I have no stake in it, but I recommend it highly. That led us to that competency framework and the professional qualification, which, as I say, is based on an evaluation of a portfolio of practice and a holding to account against that. This is available globally, where we look both at systems knowledge and skills, specific systems approaches that seem to us to be justified in being derived from the systems laws in various ways, but also intervention practices, knowledge and skills that are those things that are necessary and support the actual systems thinking. So you need to be able to do all kinds of things, some of which are systems aligned, but don't necessarily, derive from the laws, but are very relevant in context. There's a knowledge base behind all of these approaches as well, where you can get reference materials and build learning if you don't already know and have an approach to those. And then over a period of about 5 years, and I've played a very bit part in this, a supporting role. There are many stars much bigger than me in this movie. We got to in England and I think in Wales, a government-funded 30-month, one-day release from work, where you're then coming back to work and applying the thinking that we set up. To achieve that involved a lot of what we fondly describe as snorkeling through sewage, working with badly designed, counterproductive, frustrating, terribly bureaucratic, inspection and control based, awful systems. You wouldn't believe it, and a badly incentivized pseudo market in order to actually make this happen. So, we are not a group of people who probably have much, if any, pleasure from doing that snorkeling part. Some people perversely do. So that's been a real slog. But it's real. It really exists. We provide it, and with a provider called Cherith Simmons in the UK. There are other providers available, and we're teaching, we're engaging. We've got apprentices on the thing. We've got an assessment organisation set up to do the evaluation and check this off. So this is just one example, but it's based on a globally available professional approach, which covers the bases, I think, in terms of what's been discussed in this conference so far. My practice is mostly working in public services and beyond that in services more widely. I run a consultancy called RedQuadrant, and the dynamics of consultancy make systems practice, make doing the right thing sometimes, make running an organization in the kind of way I want to run an organization somewhat difficult. When we set up our consultancy, we had a marketing campaign called the Campaign Against Consultancy, where we were trying to make the point that so much consultancy is done badly or unhelpfully, and we want to do ourselves out of the job by creating capability, capacity. We were inspired by two organizations, Eden McCallum, who are a network strategy consultancy, very successful, bigger than McKinsey in the UK when I last checked. Who are a network of independent expert strategy consultants who don't want to work for McKinsey and the like anymore, but want to work in that network way. We were also inspired by my local Southwest London cab company, who had the brilliant idea in 2008 of running cabs by putting a great big computer in the boot with a global positioning system. And when you phoned up and ordered your cab, the nearest cab to you was automatically routed to you. And if they turned it down, then they were knocked off the system for 40 minutes. So we were Uber for consulting before Uber existed. So my company, RedQuadrant, isn't quite that idealized model that we wanted in 2008-9 when we were talking about and then setting it up. But we are a network consultancy which uses a wide range of expert consultants in specific roles, that doesn't employ anybody except a couple of really great junior consultants and an operations team, where we contract per project. We maintain adult-to-adult relationships. We recognize that some people are part of the family, but some people just want a gig, just transactional. And what we've discovered is that we can keep this going. It's sustainable. It's very homeostatic. Whatever we do and whatever the market does, we tend to end the year pretty much the same. And we've achieved more than, in big consultancies, you can get a bubble for between 3 to 5 years of doing things differently, innovatively, doing things the way you want to. We've been going for nearly 14 years now. But we can't really, from this model, try to target particular clients, work with particular consultants, even if we really like them, or use particular methods and approaches. So the pressures of our market, as we'd expect, knowing what structural coupling is and how it works on a business, massively shape us as an organization. And our clients, particularly in the UK public sector, live in a world of complexity. So about 8 years before COVID, I created this model of 4 dimensions of complexity. They're working with wicked, messy problems, or problems that appear to them and are engaged by them as wicked, messy, complex. They are complex living organizations. They're working across their boundaries with suppliers and partners and citizens as part of a much wider place-based system. And pressure to deliver is increasing and resources are decreasing. We set up in 2009, just before we had the government in 2010 that introduced austerity in the UK that's never stopped since, so the budgets have been reducing. So we are trying to do systems complexity cybernetics work to some degree in that context. And I would say only about 20% of our work, maybe even being generous, and that's mostly around leadership and organizational development, capability building, and building the capability of other people to do transformation work and consultancy. And this kind of approach is really systems focused. There are some examples there of the kind of systems work that we are doing, but we are increasingly able to bring in systems thinking without labeling it, without talking about it, often without using formal methodologies, inside, the core of our general consultancy project work, which is very responsive to the market and so on. I'm trying constantly to move beyond working just in that way and just in public sector, but it's really difficult. If we were trying to form a consultancy from the people who joined this conference, or the kind of people that I've consistently tried to work with to build, wider offerings, it's like herding cats to the nth degree. They're post-conventional, unruly, self-motivated, probably in the curmudgeonly space, really, really hard, and really, really hard to bring that to market in an intentional way. I'm doing that through 2 networks at the moment, the Open Eyes Collaborative and Requisite Agility movement and thing. What I am able to do is offer this as training. So the apprenticeship is one example. I'm doing some systems thinking training with a large US merchant bank in the next few months, with a French bank, with a German financial service, German and Irish financial services organization. So you can get it in the fringes, but I've not been able to kind of go out there and do the systems thinking thing at scale, although others do, and it does really work. So finally, communities of practice and inquiry is in here, and there was a request when I was asked to speak to talk about the networks that I support and mostly just do very passive facilitation of. There's a lot out there, and if you're not engaged, I encourage you to be so. My main thing in that is the systems community of inquiry, where I'm literally, as I said, it's a weblog, it's a link, it's a website of links to all the things that I find in the systems complexity and cybernetic world. I make a few concessions to quality, and do filter a few things out, but very few. Everything I find, and the weird thing about this is you can be cruising the galaxy for decades, and then you turn a corner and you find a completely new spiral arm of systems practice in internal family systems, or ecosystem dynamics, or the close and interesting connection with permaculture, or in sociology, or in philosophy, particularly interesting to talk about the pragmatists in a cybernetics and complexity and systems thinking point of view. We still have the systems thinking network on LinkedIn, despite Gene having given up on it many years ago. We resuscitated it. So there's a group on LinkedIn. There's a couple of groups on Facebook. They're quite big. They're sort of active, but they're not really dynamic and purposeful. SIO runs as a network and runs a lot of great events, many of them free, all great value. There's a systems thinking events map worldwide that Nick and Anin runs, and I support that. There are movements around systems change, systems convening. These are just 2 that I happen to be involved in. Systems innovation, I think, is a great example of the popularizers. Systems innovation is a great dynamic global populous, successful network that doesn't seem to care about getting things right exactly, but does engage. Obviously, I've left off the whole of operational research, which is massive and probably 50 times the size of the systems thinking movement. I've left off systems engineers. I always have a hard time with engineers. And then, of course, then my favorite societies are the American Society for Cybernetics, ISSS, the Cybernetics Society in the UK, Metaforum, which is a Stafford Beer influenced original organization, etc., etc., etc. My final point is what I've learned from all this is you can do what you want, but you have to pay the price. It is dangerous to have a job that's also your hobby. It leads to you staying up until 2 a.m. And talking to a select group of people on the other side of the world, things like that. It's also dangerous to be purist. You end up pushing yourself to one of the corners of the quadrant. I try and stay in the middle, but then that's a risk as well because my consultancy business is almost dangerously focused on responding to tenders, responding to the market, and so on. You've got to realize in networks, in business, not everybody's along for the ride. It's great, paraphrasing Bateson, organizations are not made up of people, they're made up of parts of people. And the looser you are in your organization structure and your learning community, the more rigor and tightness you need to define some boundaries, to define some ways of working and some of the protocols that allow you to be loose. And I've also found that communities that try to have a tight goal, communities of practice that try and have a project, that try and define themselves and focus themselves on something truly collaborative, usually die out when that project either fails or succeeds. I quite like loose and vague communities that can ping in things now and again, form small little spin-off groups, and then but keep going. And I found that my community building tools I've experienced a lot of those. I would prefer Discord or sticking to email. And I really do not like the Mighty Networks community, which is a temptation for all of the groups that I'm in by the looks of it. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Well, one of the great things about loose communities is that they allow legitimate peripheral participation. One of the original concepts from communities of practice, which is, hanging around, doing small tasks, being useful or just observing. It took me 4 years of spending 4 days a year in a room from 10 till 4 with experts talking and applying and really using the viable systems model before I felt that I really dropped it, that I really understood it. And that for me was legitimate peripheral participation. I provided coffee and croissants and I listened and I learned. So it's going to be interesting what comes next in all of these fields for the profession, for RedQuadrant and for consultancy and for these communities of practice. My plug is, if any of these things interest you, I run my own learning community. We have a backdrop of a 24 module, it's probably MBA kind of level, study program online, self-paced, well, kind of self-paced. Then we bring people together twice a month in small learning groups to actually share and learn and discuss all of the content and all of the ideas and so on. And I have some particular favorites listed in there that are kind of some of my favorite sources that I use and find reliably useful in my practice. So this is for people who are facilitators, consultants, coaches, leaders, systems leaders, systems conveners, etc., etc. And people typically join for 6 months or a year and go through the backdrop of the 24 modules across a 1-year period. So I'm very happy to be in touch about any of this anytime. Some of my main links are on there, and hopefully this presentation can be made available, Joseph, to participants. I'll send across a PDF after this session. The main links are all at bentaylor.com, as I started off by saying. So thanks. That was a canter, I appreciate. I covered a fair amount of ground, but hopefully some of that has triggered some interest amongst some of you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thanks. Any comments or questions?
Actually, before we start discussing the systems thinking aspects of it, I love your organization, because 25 years ago, I did my doctoral dissertation on why don't groups of small businesses form that kind of virtual corporation and bid on US government contracts to compete against the big guys, because all those contracts were knowledge intensive and not capital equipment intensive.
Yeah. Oh, really interesting. Yep.
And I really love to see you're making it work.
To some extent.
Well, yeah, you've got a credibility problem for a start.
Yeah, we don't tend to win the biggest pieces of work, that's for sure.
Yeah,
it's always a challenge. Always a challenge.
but that was good. One of the things about complexity all the way up at the beginning was, to me, when you talked about complex systems are unpredictable, to me, that just means we don't understand them. If we understood them, we could predict them.
Well, you can predict them within a certain framing. But give me an example, Joseph, of a complex system that you can understand and predict.
A cruise ship, a cruise company.
Yeah, well, that's great, as long as the pilot doesn't want to, as long as the captain doesn't want to buzz his village back home and steer dangerously close to the rocks, or as long as it doesn't get caught up in a tsunami or a global pandemic. My point is simply that there's always going to be a framing that can undermine your ability to control and predict. Potentially out there. We do achieve incredible things, and that's why we need those framings, because we create a framing for a cruise company which is very all-encompassing, which is global. I've worked with a shipping company that was Greek-based, but had its crew all trained and crewed up from the Philippines. And sitting next to the guy who was responsible for getting the right crew with the right papers in the right port, with the right transit papers to go through all the places that they had to go through, usually flying, in order to get to the port, etc., was mind-boggling. Partly that's the type of challenge that is low in its complexity, because we can partition it down and we can manage the things in a modular way. But anyway, yeah, we can achieve incredible, mind-boggling degrees of complexity. And you're right to say, my current favorite expression is, VUCA is not a condition of the world, it's an experience. So it depends on our ability to understand in the framing that we're in. But underlying total predictability, I would say, is undermined by the fact that there can always be a bigger frame, or sometimes maybe a minuscule thing that could potentially undermine what you're in control of, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I agree with you. What we're doing is we're working within or at the edge of our boundary of knowledge.
Yep.
And as we
Absolutely.
learn more, we expand the boundary of knowledge, and things move from unpredictable to predictable. But then we also realize that there's something, it's that knowledge knowledge you don't know, triplet, that there's always something out there that's unpredictable. We don't quite understand it yet. And that's what all this research is doing. It's expanding our body of knowledge.
Some of that will also take us into areas which create new vulnerabilities. I totally agree. I mean, we're in agreement here. But it's interesting, isn't it, that some of that will take us into, the ability to tightly couple supply chains takes us into new vulnerabilities with tightly coupled supply chains. For example, so the tighter you squeeze, the more the little bits will squeeze out around the edges. But yes, we are clearly at the moment, touch wood, in a progressive state where we can get better at most things over time and expand our scope. Yeah.
Sure.
Pascal, you wanna?
Yes. Benjamin, thanks for a good presentation. I heard you mention the viable system framework, probably the one by Stanford Beer. I
That's
like
right.
it because I worked in large infrastructure projects, and very few people appreciate that when you deliver a large infrastructure project, it affects the making of the organization. It affects the operational fiber, the financial fiber of the organization. So through the whole process, you need to maintain the viability of the organization from the pre-project to the after project. I'm struggling to find a documentation. I've got a few videos and a few papers from Mr. Bier or Dr. Bier. I'm not sure who he is. Can you perhaps direct me to some resources in that field?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there's a lot out there. So, in a sense, I'm struggling to. There is in the UK's. I'm going to try and look it up on Systems Community of Inquiry while we're talking. But in the UK's guidance on complex project management, there is now inclusion and recognition of the viable systems model. Maybe it's complex program management, but that might be a good way in based on what you said. There are a number of books by Stafford Beer that are recommendable, and I would particularly recommend The Fractal Organization, also by Patrick Oversnut, who I keep plugging. If you go to the
sorry,
website,
Benjamin, do you mind
I'll put them in the chat,
it on the chat? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That will help.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great. I'll add them as we're talking.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other comment?
Well, I'd like to hear from Joe about his connection to Stafford Beer. That sounds quite intriguing.
My connection to Stafford Beer or different connection?
No, different Joe.
Different
Joe Bradley.
Bradley, Captain Bradley.
Somebody picked up on that. So my advisor is Charles Keating. Keating's advisor was Barry Edmonds, and Edmonds was a student of Stafford Beer. Beer never got his doctorate, but was permitted to chair several PhD committees, which is very interesting.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Just like my other hero, well, Wittgenstein did get his PhD, but he got it on the basis of the Tractatus and being vouched for by Bertrand Russell. So he cheated as well.
Well, whether you have a doctorate or not doesn't have anything to do with your competence and expertise.
Mm-hmm. I'll agree with you on that, Dr. Kasser, because I got my doctorate when I was 57 years old. But if we can go back, I'm going to put a link. Unfortunately, it's probably paywalled to what's called the Complex System Governance Reference Model, which is what Keating and I have done to extend Beer's original VSM based on intervening research since Stafford died.
Okay, in the chat. Yeah, I got my doctorate late in life as well, about 25 years ago. So yeah, I was about that age.
Let's hope for us all yet.
Well, I found I had two kinds of doctoral students, the young ones and the senior ones. And the senior ones wanted to solve a problem, whereas the younger ones were interested in getting a doctorate and would do whatever the advisor asked them to do. So they were the grad student slaves, as opposed to the senior people who had to find an advisor who was interested in dealing with their problem.
Any more questions or comments?
You talked about, Benjamin, you talked about the communities of inquiry. Mm-hmm. I found that in my field of systems engineering, what passes for communities of inquiry doesn't seem to have any practical use. There's a lot of talk.
Yeah. Well, I guess my experience, the SCIO was, and I think still is, but I'm just in a different phase now. I think the best learning community I've ever been a part of, because it had a really good mix of robust conversation, applying the thing by experts, but enough openness for me to be comfortable and confident to join and explore. And for me, I like to sort of just immerse myself in too much information, and as a way of learning. So that was excellent for me. They are mostly about learning and conversation, much like this summit, I suppose, more than they're about doing. But then SCIO has ended up doing quite a lot in terms of the professional standard and so on that I've described, and a body of knowledge, which a number of these organizations, particularly with Zoom and video now, are building up.
Right. It's them that can do, them that can't do, talk.
Perhaps.
Okay, the links are going into the chat, and what we might do sometime in the future is copy the links out of the chat into the discussion below the recording.
Okay. I think, Bruce, you have a comment or a question?
I have a question, I guess. So I am I have some experience in systems engineering, but I'm surely new to the systems thinking perspective on it. There appears to me to be a split between experienced individuals and their inability to interact with up and coming people or people new into a profession. I see it in systems engineering. I'm seeing it here also. In trying to follow along with this conversation and understand where and how to get started. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's fair to say that systems practice is not yet fully a profession, although it's beginning to be, or it's not a large profession; it's a nascent profession. I guess is more accurate. And it has, so it's undergoing that shift, as I talked about, across the chasm from a few enthusiasts to a much bigger group of the general population, and much more of a work focus than a belief and hobby, and hobby's too soft for it, a kind of religion focus. So we're in quite a different place. I don't know. I find that the experienced people are pretty generous in giving their time and engaging and wanting to share, although they may fit into one of those quadrants that I talked about. And I guess there is a question about the design of communities of practice and the design of teaching. I did teach for a while an undergraduate module on systems thinking, and I'm a bit like politics and journalism and quite a few other professions. I'm not convinced that systems practice is. But I believe it should be taught. What's the American expression? K whatever to 13, K13 or whatever.
K12,
it is. Yeah, K12. Okay. But I actually don't think that it's. I think you should be in a proper job first, like being a politician. you might be a systems thinker in a normal job, but I don't think you should go into systems practice kind of as an undergraduate, at Oxford. Until about 1960, they refused to teach undergraduates continental philosophy on the basis that it might warp their tiny little minds.
I think you should be a systems thinker to start with. So that's a different problem. And I think most of us may be, just not formally. But I guess
but there's a risk in making that your profession. Is my point.
Well, I'm not as concerned about the. I'm not as concerned about the profession part of it, but I think there's value in viewing the world. But I think the thing that I've seen that I have the question on is, it appears to me now that I've been looking at this for 6 or 7 months, which is all it is that the a number of the formal professions, systems engineering, system dynamics, some quantity of the ecology movement is all driven by GST and the ideas of systems thinking, but they don't seem to acknowledge each other or the history. It's sort of like they're sort of floating out there, and I think that's one of the problems I'm at least observing. I've got 30 years as a
differentiation of because there've been these wars. Go on, Bruce. Carry on. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say I've got 30 years in systems engineering, and it's taken me till 6 months ago to formally be introduced to systems thinking. There are some systems thinkers. I mean, Joe Bradley seems to have a longer term experience in that, but you surely don't see in COSI, which is the professional group, that this concept flows through. So I'm amazed, in its own way, that people who should be systems thinking, no matter whether they're going to acknowledge it or not, don't see the need to tie these pieces together.
So
no problem. I mean, like it's the 2 minutes rule, but we can see if there is any other people would like to comment or say the question.
I just want to respond quickly to that, right? If it's okay.
No problem. Please.
There was a great piece written many years ago. The title of which might be good enough, and I'm trying to find it and remember. I always get it wrong. Called "Wrecking Synergy to Stake Out Territory," and a lot of the divide between new, exciting, wonderful, modern complexity and old, boring, old-fashioned, limited systems thinking can be explained by this. People need to define themselves as a new or a distinct field in order to attract funding and enthusiasm and followers and all the rest. And therefore, they have to deny their history and cut themselves off from it, at least for as long as is convenient, while they build their credibility and space and so on. And there have been, even within systems thinking per se, internecine academic wars of conflict where you have to take one side. So there's been a lot of that over the years, and that's a huge part of the problem. And it's a huge part of the problem specifically when you are in the professional domain, when you move out of when you're in a discipline, when you're in a focus area, because that's when things get concretized and boundaries are set. And we get those kind of results. I don't know what the answer to that is, unfortunately, but I do think just working quite hard I work quite hard to say, look, there's all this stuff out here. It's massively interconnected. There are lots of dividing lines, but most of the dividing lines that we talk about, like complexity and systems thinking, or cybernetics and whatever else, or systems engineering or whatever else, they're not good dividing lines. Because actually, there's loads of stuff in systems engineering that is very much like systems thinking, and there's loads of stuff. The dividing lines are different, if that makes sense. They're about approaches, about mindsets, about perspectives.
I think Joe and Niels, they said, like, if people aren't talking about systems thinking, does that mean they are not doing it? So some people practice it or do it. Like Niels in his presentation yesterday, he talked about he's using systems thinking without saying it, that he's using it, because people have resistance for new terms. Anyway, thank you for the remark. I think we have 5 minutes break before the other session. So Benjamin, do you mind please to put the last book in the chat so people can read it or search for it? The one you mentioned now.
Yeah, if I can remember what it was. I think
No
I did.
problem.
I think
Yeah.
I put that early on. That was the fractal organization.
Mhm.
And the other one I recommended throughout was the grammar of systems, which I think, and if we can get to more fundamental laws and things like that, then they're not all true laws, but that grammar, then we can build things up as we go. So I think we just have to be very active in commenting on against those staking out of the territory that's anti synergistic.
Cool. So, I mean, we will stop the recording for now, and thank you.